Blaming the user in those situations is just a cop-out. It lets the designers off the hook for creating systems that are confusing, unforgiving, and just plain difficult to use.
So whose fault is it, really? Is it the person trying to walk the tightrope? Or is it the person who designed such a treacherous obstacle course in the first place? It's a really thought-provoking way to look at it.
It really is. And Norman provides this great perspective on this whole thing. And he says that these errors, these slip-ups, are often more about communication breakdowns between people and the systems they're using.
It's like the designer's speaking one language and the user's speaking another, and they're both just talking past each other.
Exactly. And just like in any relationship, communication is key. Designers really need to anticipate those potential breakdowns and build in those safeguards, those safety nets, to prevent those errors from happening in the first place.
So it's all about clear communication.
Precisely. It's like those, "Are you sure you want to delete this?" messages we see on computers all the time. That's an attempt to prevent what Norman calls a slip, a moment of inattention where our brains go on autopilot and we accidentally delete the wrong file or send an email to the wrong person.
Oh, I know those moments all too well. Wait, no, I didn't mean to hit reply all.
Exactly. But as useful as those warning messages can be, Norman points out that they can also be super annoying and ineffective if they're not designed well. Like if we're constantly bombarded with pop-up messages for every little thing, we're going to start ignoring them, which defeats the purpose entirely.
It's like crying wolf.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot, that delicate balance between preventing errors and not overwhelming the user with a million warnings. And that all comes back to understanding the user's context and designing systems that are both forgiving and supportive.
Because, let's face it, we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes at some point, no matter how well designed something is.
Exactly. We're not perfect. And you know what really helped me understand this whole thing about errors and accidents? Norman introduces this concept called the Swiss cheese model. It sounds kind of strange at first, but it's actually a brilliant way to visualize how multiple failures can line up to cause those big accidents.
Okay, the Swiss cheese model. You've definitely piqued my curiosity.
So imagine each slice of cheese represents a layer of defense in a system, okay? And those holes in the cheese, those are the weaknesses, those little gaps where things can potentially slip through.
I'm picturing it. I've got my Swiss cheese, I've got my layers. Okay, go on.
Now, most of the time, those holes don't line up perfectly, right? So even if there's a weakness in one layer, the other layers are there to catch it, and they prevent those accidents from happening.
Okay, so the other slices of cheese act as a safety net.
Exactly. But every now and then, those holes, they align perfectly, and that's when things really hit the fan.
Oh, no. Not my Swiss cheese.
Right. And it's not usually just one thing that causes those major accidents, but a combination of factors. It's like all those little holes lining up to create the perfect storm. And as Norman points out, this applies to design, too.
So it's not enough to just address one potential point of failure. You have to look at the whole system.
Precisely. He argues that good design is all about adding more layers of defense, more slices of cheese, if you will, to reduce the likelihood of those holes lining up and creating those opportunities for errors and accidents.
So more cheese equals a safer system. I can get behind that.
Exactly. And one of the ways designers can add those layers is through something Norman calls forcing functions.
Forcing functions. That sounds intense.
It does, doesn't it? But it's not as scary as it sounds. Basically, these are design elements that prevent us from making those errors in the first place. They force us to do things the right way.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Like, for instance, you can't start a car without putting the key in the ignition first, right?
Okay.
Right. That's a forcing function. The design literally prevents you from starting the car unless you've completed that specific action. It's like those child-proof caps on medicine bottles. You have to push down and turn at the same time. It's an extra step, but it's there to prevent those potentially dangerous mistakes.
So it's about building in those safety checks at every stage of the game.
Exactly. It's about anticipating potential errors and designing them out of the system as much as possible. But even with the best designed systems, mistakes will inevitably happen. We're human, after all. And I love how Norman emphasizes the importance of creating a culture where people feel comfortable reporting those errors, those near misses, without fear of being shamed or blamed.
Because nobody wants to be labeled the problem or the weak link in the system. It can create this culture of silence where people are afraid to speak up.
Exactly, but Norman points out that those mistakes are actually valuable learning opportunities. He talks about how NASA implemented this voluntary accident reporting system where pilots could anonymously report errors they had made or observed. And the goal wasn't to punish anyone, it was to learn from those mistakes and make the system safer for everyone.
It's recognizing that we're all in this together, right? We can all learn from each other's experiences, both good and bad.
Exactly. It's a much more humane and ultimately more effective approach than simply pointing fingers and blaming individuals.
You know, this whole deep dive into Norman's book has really been eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing the world in a whole new light. Like I'm noticing design flaws everywhere I look now, which I guess is both a blessing and a curse.
It's like he's given us this X-ray vision into the hidden world of design, right? We start to see those subtle cues, those hidden constraints, all those psychological principles that are constantly shaping our everyday experiences. It's both fascinating and a little terrifying when you think about it.
It really is. And
Mm.
hopefully, with a little more awareness of those things, we can all become better designers in our own right, even if we're not designing physical objects or complex systems.
Yeah.
Whether it's organizing our kitchens for maximum efficiency or advocating for more user-friendly software at work, we can all play a role in making the world a slightly less frustrating place.
Absolutely. We all have that power.
So the next time you encounter a confusing door, or you find yourself wrestling with a particularly stubborn gadget, remember Don Norman and his wisdom. It's not you, it's the design. And with a little bit of empathy and a lot of thoughtful design, we can create a world where those everyday frustrations become a thing of the past. Until then, happy designing, everyone.